on the cloud and start the webinar. So we're now broadcasting. We got the recording going and we got the broadcast going, and people are beginning to join us. So welcome to Thoughts on Thursday. These Thursdays come round so quick. It's incredible.
Right.
So thank you for joining us. Hello, Carol. Hello, Jonathan, Stacy, Steve, Mr. Hemmings. How are you? Now, there's lots of people's names I don't recognize, but it is always a pleasure to recognize some of the names of people coming. So it'll be interesting to see how far away you all are today, because of course Chris is out in Australia. Where in Australia are you, Chris?
I live in a suburb called Mossman in Sydney. It's basically well known as one of the most affluent, if not the most affluent suburb in Australia. In fact, you mentioned Mossman to an Australian, they instantly know where it is. And we live very close to the zoo. And if we'd started this webinar about 2 hours ago, you would have heard the lions roaring away in the zoo because it was sunset. So, you know, it's quite funny. So there we are.
All right.
But it's a beautiful place to live. I mean, I went into for lunch today. I went to a rugby club lunch and heard John Eales at my club, and heard John Eales and Nick Farr-Jones talking. It was a great lunch. Right. And you catch the ferry. We go across into Sydney CBD by ferry. Catch the ferry from Toronto to back again. So there we are.
Well, you've got some locals. You've got some people in Brisbane on the call today. So it's 11 o'clock. We're going to make a start. So Chris, if you can show the next slide, please, everybody, be excited because Chris Gollis is in the room. Now, this man has written some amazing books which changed my life. I've been able to get on with people, a much wider range of people, and I've been able to influence a much wider range of people. So his books on emotional intelligence for salespeople and for managers, empathy selling in particular, had a huge impact on me. You know, he started in the London Business School, went into IT as an engineer, ended up as a general manager, and became an investment banker, and has spent the last 15 or so years working on emotional intelligence. And in my opinion, he is one of the global leaders on understanding emotional intelligence. That's absolute honor and a pleasure to welcome Chris. Please remember to change your chat settings so that we can interact with you and share everything that's going. But I will now hand over to Chris for the next 45 to 55 minutes. Chris, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Bob, very much for inviting me along. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Walter Blackburn, who will pop up later. He sort of introduced me to Bob. And so thanks very much for the opportunity to talk with you. And what I'm going to do today is, in fact, tell you what 2 secrets to career success that I believe what they are. And actually, secondly, just give you a bit about my emotional intelligence journey, which happened to me and how I got there. So there's what you need to do if you want to make a chat comment. I must confess, I'm very much happier handling questions at the end, but I've been told I should suggest 1 or 2 questions, which I haven't done during the webinar. Actually, to be honest with you, when I do webinars and people ask the questions, you sort of think to yourself, do I actually need to do this? Please give me the information, but that's my personality. But anyway, let's continue on. So the 2 real keys to your career success, and you'll hear from my accent that my father was American and my mother was English. And what happened was he was in the American Air Force, and I was born in Bath in England, but at the age of 3 months, we went back and lived on American Air Force bases, in fact, till 1957. And then we went back to Bath. And there's a great saying about the Quakers in America. They went to America to do good and ended up doing rather well. That's what my father did. He ended up, in fact, owning about 15 of those Georgian houses in Bath, and we were renting them out to students. And what happened was I managed, going back, got good study habits, and went to Cambridge, where I read natural sciences and economics. And I'll never forget what happened. I was reading chemistry as my major and did experimental psychology as a minor in my first year. And Cambridge, if you know, has the most Nobel Prize winners in science. That's his claim to fame, right? And the first lecture of the experimental psychology, I've never forgotten it, because the chap stood up and said, "Welcome to Cambridge. You are now at the home and citadel of empiricism and skepticism." experiment and observation is much more important than innate ideas and traditions. And he stood up and said, astrology is a quack science. Freud was a quack scientist, and even worse, Jung was a bigger quack scientist. And that was how he started. And what he said was, what we believe in here in Cambridge is experiment and observation. For example, the best paper written in experimental psychology so far was written by a chap called Miller. And this paper was written in '56, and it's called The Magical Number 7 ± 2. And we were all required to read it. It's a very impressive paper, very, very good. But what happened was, what Miller did is he proved that the limit of your short-term memory is 7 items. I've never forgotten that. And he said, you know, if you're trying to remember or tell people to remember something, don't have more than 7 items in it. So that's how it came across. And as Bob said, what happened then, after 3 years, I joined what was the Google and Facebook at the time. That was IBM. A couple of years with them as a system programmer, then joined a couple of startups that both went bankrupt. Ended up finishing up as a project manager for KLM in Amsterdam, which this is when Amsterdam was taking over from London as a swinging city in Europe. And what happened then is I thought my CV needed a bit of repair. So I managed to get it into the London Business School. I was in this number 6 quote. They'd only been going about 6 years, and it's of course located in Regent's Park. It's got a fantastic reputation now, and the first time to admit, I'll be the first to admit, I rode that reputation upwards in my career, because more and more people heard about London Business School, and it was a fantastic school. It was giving a great education. And I was very fortunate. I really enjoyed my 2 years there and was awarded a distinction. But the other claim to fame is Charles Handy was my tutor. Now, Charles Handy, don't forget, this is 1973. He was the dean of the MBA program, but we would meet every couple of weeks, 3 weeks for a sherry, or maybe for a coffee, or sometimes have lunch. And he'd just chat to me about how's it going on. I mean, he was a fascinating individual. And he has a number of claims to fame, but I always think two of the ones I really liked was that in Fortune magazine, he was named the 1990s business guru. For an American magazine to say an English person is the best management guru in the world at the moment is one claim. And he was one of 5 gurus asked to contribute to the 75th anniversary edition of the Harvard Business Review. This came out in 1997. The other 4 were American, but Charles was the only one invited. So what happened is I was meeting Charles and he said, Chris, this is in '73, there's a bit of a recession on. He said, have you managed to get a job yet? And I said, Charles, I've got the big one. I've been flown twice to New York by McKinsey's for interviews. And he said, they've offered me a job in their head office. And he looked at me pensively for a couple of minutes. He said, Chris, you know, I don't know if I'd accept that position if I was you. And this shattered most MBA people when they heard it, because this is like the dream job of most MBA sort of people studying an MBA. He said, I've come to the conclusion the secret to career success is to be good at one-on-one meetings, right? He said, that's when it actually happens. That's when you get the job. That's when you raise finance for your company. That's when you close the sale. It's the one-on-one meeting when you're actually talking to the decision maker and you impress them. You learn you understand what makes them tick, and you do it. You know what I'd do if I was you, Chris? And I said, what, Charles? Just totally bemused at this. He said, you should forget the job with McKinsey's. He said, look, there's a lot, you hear about the success stories, but there's a lot of consultants, business management consultants out there. He said, what I suggest to you, and this is very typical Charles Handy, I become a salesperson, because if you don't learn how to sell, you won't eat, right? And I took his advice. Now, what happened was, in England in '73 was a pretty tough position. It was, you know, there was a UK port strike and there was a miners' strike. And we actually had a debate at the London Business School where the miners right or wrong. And I've never forgotten that debate, because out of the 100 people who attended, 98 voted in favor of the miners and 2 said no. And I was one of the 2, right? And my argument was, at that time, I'd been down a coal mine in England and there were mining seams of coal that thick by hand. Whereas in Australia, the average coal miner presses a button, the drag chute goes across. They won't dig for coal in Australia unless the seam is at least 30 meters deep, right? That's the look. They just remove the overburden and then start filling up the trucks, right? The average coal miner in Australia is 100 times more productive than an English coal miner. And the annual subsidy at the time in England to each coal miner was 5 times their annual salary. That was what was was being paid to the coal companies. And I said, this can't go on. Now, remember, this is, I said, 6 years before Thatcher, and the change to England, it became much more dynamic, its economy fantastic. But anyway, I came in as the last what Australia calls the 10-pound palms. And I started as a salesman with ICL Australia. And then I was introduced to the second secret of career success, which I'm going to talk about in more detail later. But it was what's called the Hum Wadsworth. And it was run by a gentleman called Kevin Chandler. Chandler Cloud had basically got the copyright to this test, right? I used it very successfully in selling. And I ended up becoming a divisional manager with a company called TNT, which at that time was a major Australian multinational. And they had an armored car division, which was linked up with the computerized payroll division. And I was the divisional manager of the computerized payroll division. And adopting the TNT selling system and marrying it with the Hum Wadsworth, I have several claims to fame. In 4 years, we doubled our sales volumes, quadrupled our revenue, profit went up 10 times. And our return on investment in the final year was something it was something like 157%, which is not a bad ROI for a division. Anyway, but my big claim to fame, in the last 18 months I was there, we were involved in 15 major tenders. On a market share basis, we should have got 1, maybe 2. We won every tender. Why? Because I'd developed a selling system where I married the Hum Wadsworth, as I called it then, to the TNT selling system. Okay, and it was all based on the magic number 7. The guy who developed the TNT selling system said, you know, what you had to learn was 7 objections, because he had read Miller's paper, totally believed in it, 7 ways of handling objections and 7 ways of closing. And if one technique failed, try another. And I said, no. Each of the 7 closing techniques marries up with one of the 7 traits in the Hum Wadsworth. Work out what people have, analyze what they've got, and then that's the closing techniques you use. And that's how the system developed. Right. So what happened was I had my midlife crisis. Is this as good as it gets? And I got convinced by a graduate I'd hired to sort of look at, I should consider investment banking. And I taught my way into a bank called BT Australia, which was the Australian subsidiary of Bankers Trust in New York and America. And I launched the BT Cash Management Trust, the BT Split Trust, which was the first equity product to reach $1 billion in Australia. And then government handed out venture capital licenses, and we got one of the first 7. And I was very fortunate because, well, a couple of us worked out a strategy to raise the money, and we were the only MIC, venture capital fund at the time, to effectively raise our allocated capital. I never forgot it because we worked out it was the June 30 product. This is when the tax year ends. And we got something like $13 million and $5,000 checks arrived at our office in the last 2 days, at June 29th and June 30th. It was just absolutely, I've never had it before. It was raining checks, okay, which was a nice feeling to have. And it was great. I then got headhunted by Australia's leading stockbroker at the time called Rennie Rivkin, and I had some reasonably good successes. But what I had was the most important meeting of my career. This is the one-on-one meeting that Charles Handy was talking about. And what happened was I had written I was at that time writing on the board of JASA, which was the quarterly magazine of the Securities Institute. And I'd written a couple of articles for them on venture capital. And then Edna Carew, was the editor, she was Australia's leading financial journalist at the time, was asked by Alan Wunman to write a book on venture capital because it was beginning to get talked about. And she very kindly said, look, it's not really a subject that interests me, but there's this young guy called Chris Golis. And why don't you go, now remember, this is 1988, 87, 88. You ought to talk to him. He's actually not a bad writer. So I get this phone call saying, would you like to come to lunch? I'd like to meet you. My name's John Ironmonger. I'm the publisher with Alan Unwin. So I said, sure. And so I turn up. You know, he says, we'll meet at this little Italian restaurant I like going to. And it's one of the nicest Italian restaurants in Sydney, as it should be with John. And I'm sitting there, I get there 15 minutes early, and I see this guy walk in. He's wearing a leather jacket, Armani. He's wearing an Armani coat, got a beard, etc. He's avoiding eye contact, and I go, oh my God. Just a minute, let me just clear that out. And I said, oh my God, this chap is dominant in the artist trait. And one of the major things I cover in my courses is one of the great objections to people is they don't like you. you have personality dissonance with people. And these people particularly don't like me because I'm loud, noisy, assertive, aggressive, and they're introverted, quiet, etc. So what happens is we sit down and I'm looking away from them and avoiding eye contact and mumbling a bit with my hand over my mouth. These are all techniques to deal with the artist. And he suddenly says, Chris, why don't you choose the wine? And I look at him and I suddenly go, wait a minute. And I said, okay. And I said, right. And I pointed to the most expensive wine on the wine list. It was a $350 red, which at that time would now be about $700. And I said, look, you buy the lunch and you put the wine on my American Express card, which I must confess, I got out of my wallet. I thought, you are looking a bit battered, but thank God it's going to be replaced soon. Anyway, what happens was he looked at me and he said, are you sure? I said, it's the only wine on this wine list worth drinking. Yes, that's right. But I said, don't worry about it. You paid for the lunch. I'll buy the wine. And there's another long pause. And of course, if you're in selling, you know, there's a time you shut up and be quiet. And this was the time. And he said to me, no, the publisher always buys the first lunch. Put your card away. And I said, well, fair enough, your call. And that was it. And I always say to people afterwards, and this is a good question, if you want to sort of pull it, is he going to publish the book? So you can do a little poll now, Bob, if you want. That's the question for you. Is the publisher going to publish the book? Now,
okay, put an answer in the chat. Do you think, as Chris has asked, that publisher is going to publish the book?
Yes. Is he going to do
yes
it?
Or no?
So, or is he going to use me as the author? That's what I mean, right? So, just tell me when I'll give me a signal when I start again.
Yes, yeps, yup. I think we've got a whole set of yeses there, Chris.
That's good. But someone's already, maybe you saw something. Well, the answer is absolutely right, which is very shows we've got a very, very smart group of listeners here. There's two reasons why. One is obvious. He's not going to go back to his boss and say, here's a $700 expense claim. And by the way, we're not doing the book. But secondly, as I said, this person is a trait. And what they are is they beat to a different drum. They're individualists. Okay. And afterwards, I took him to lunch when we actually got the book published at my club. And that time, this time I was buying because I wanted to say thank you. And I said, you got to just tell me what actually happens when you ask that. And he said, well, I've probably taken 100 prospective authors out to lunch. And he said, first of all, he said, about a third of them, when I say, well, you choose the wine, they say, look, I don't drink at lunchtime. And he says, you know, that's great. And I always grit my teeth and say, sure, I understand. He said 1/3 then say, I'd like the house carafe wine, thank you. And I grit my teeth. And he said, but the worst third always choose the second least expensive wine on the menu. And we all know that's the one that restaurants make the biggest gross margin on. So I sort of burst out laughing. He said, Chris, you were the only person who I'd ever taken out for a prospective author publisher lunch who basically chose the most expensive wine on the menu. And he said, I just couldn't believe it. I thought, this guy is different. And you would have paid for it. I said, oh, no question. And by the way, just to give you a flavor, this book went through 5 editions. And as you'll learn later, it actually made me $5 million, right? That's how important that meeting was to me, right? That effectively completely flipped and changed my sort of wealth. And I'll explain to you how that happened in a few moments. So what happened then? Well, what happens if you're on the other side of the fence and you've actually had a book published by a reputable publisher is they say to you, Chris, have you got another book yet? And I said, well, funny enough, I do. And I dragged this manuscript out and I said, I wrote this when I was transitioning into Bankers Trust. And it effectively explains the selling system we developed there. And, you know, I'd like to, I think it's pretty interesting topic, the way it works. Would you like to publish it? Anyway, they came back to me and said, look, it's not bad. It's quite interesting, but books on selling don't sell. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, no. And I said, well, I know books on selling that sell. They said, no. It's not part of it. It's not part of their portfolio. They weren't interested in that. So I thought, solve this. So I decided I would call on the leading literary agent in Sydney, who was a woman called Jill Hickson at the time. And she was well known. She effectively was the one who got Bryce Courtney published, you know, The Power of One. And she had some other very successful authors in her portfolio. So I cold called on her, and I had the suit on, etc. And I thought what was going to happen when I went to her, what happens once you know the empathy selling technique, you sort of work out something before you go. You look at the organization, worker where they are. And I thought she would be a bit like John Ironmonger. She'd be an artist, right? And so I sort of get there, flash across my card. I was working in bankers, okay, as I said, at Rivkin, etc. And she looks at me and she says, "Oh, you're working for so-and-so." And I said, "Yes. Do you know X?" And I suddenly went, "You idiot." This is, the person above you looking down on you and just doing the sales call. I said, "You idiot. She's not an artist. What she's going to be is a raging hustler because she's a middle person. She sits between the publishers and the authors, and she's got to negotiate with both of them to get a deal done." And I said, and I said, "Yeah, well, I had lunch with him last week at Machiavelli's." This is another Italian restaurant in Sydney. And then 2 seconds later, he said, "Do you know so-and-so?" And I said, "Yes, I had a drink with him yesterday at the establishment after work. We were having a good chat about X and Y." Now I was, let's just face it, bullshitting through my teeth. But of course, hustlers, if you get to know them, love basically name dropping. They like to know they're talking to a winner. And she was convinced I was a winner. Now, what happened was I rang her 3 weeks later and said, "How do you have a look at the book?" And what I was asking her to do was recommend to me recommend to me someone who published nonfiction, because she said she didn't do it. She said, "Oh, Chris, we're going to publish the book." I said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "I thought you did nothing to do nonfiction." She said, No. She said, "This book, it's got to get published." And I said, "Well, you got to tell me the reason why." And she said, "Well, there's a chapter in there on a hustler." And I said, "Yes." She said, "It's the only book that I've ever read, or thing that I've ever read, that describes my husband perfectly." And I went, "Oh." And of course I had to laugh. Now she was actually married to the Premier of New South Wales, Neville Wran, whose nickname was Nifty, right? And there's obviously, being a politician, there's always, reporters doing profiles of politicians, but it nailed him in one. She just couldn't believe it. Of course, one of the great things is you learn as I said, reading this book, is we like people who are like ourselves. That's one of the great things. And to influence them, you've got to be a chameleon and change. And what happened was Jill Hickson was a natural hustler, and so was Neville Wran. So they got married. Now, what happened was I used this book, and I went to see Chandler McLeod, showed it to him, and he was just about to reach across and strangle me as he realized that's where his IP was. And I said, "Kevin, before you do that, we have to form a joint venture. You've got the best management technique, selling technique available. It's fantastic. What we got to do is form a training company. And here's a business plan that I've written, about 15 pages long. Because by this time I've been retrenched and I was out of work, right? Because this is post the 87 crash. And effectively all the stockbrokers were going, by 1990, we're going broke. So I was basically retrenched in June 1990, and I had to find myself a job. So I went to see Chandler McLeod and said, how about forming a training company, which is what we did. And I said, "Business plan needs $200,000. I've got $10,000. You put in 190 and we'll split the equity 50-50. And people look at me and say, "How on the earth could you ask a question like that?" And I said, "Well, when you work in venture capital, you learn how to do that with a straight face." And what happened was anyway, they bought it. They came back to me and said, "We think 50-50 is a bit rich. How about 1/3, 2/3? And of course I said, "Well, you bastards, let's, but I like you. Okay, well, I'll do it." So I thought, I'm getting a third for $10,000, 5% of the cash, and getting a third of the equity is not bad. Now, what happened is we started kicking goals, and that's when I met Walter Blackburn, and he became the first UK distributor and was, using it very, very well. But two things happened to me in 1995. First of all, Emotional Intelligence was published by Daniel Goleman. That's when I first came across the term. And secondly, St. George Bank appeared on the horizon. They, at that time, were Australia's 5th largest bank. And the chap who was ultimately the decision maker said, "We want to set up a venture capital fund, and we're going to invest $20 million in it as a starter. And what we'd like to do is have you tender for the management." Well, that, of course, is one of the best offers you could ever have in your life. So what happened was that book, Enterprise and Venture Capital, brought me the sort of credibility with St. George Bank, and we tendered for the management we wanted. And then what happened is they actually subscribed in 2 other funds that we raised, and we had 3 funds. And if you know anything about venture capital, the great thing is the fee structure is 2% a year on a 10-year contract. That's 20%. So effectively, we got $28 million as fees, the venture fees. And let's just say, as the 50% equity holder of Nanyang, I had 2 partners I gave 25% each to. I said a certain amount of that money went in my direction. And I said, I think it was worth about $5 million to me. So that's the story of that. However, what I'm going to do is now talk about the emotional intelligence side. So that's what happened, right? So I was busy in venture capital, and once you run a venture capital fund, that becomes dominant. But in 2007, I was 63. I've been doing it for 25 years. I thought this is it. And, and what happens with venture capital, you have to commit yourself for 10 years. It's called the key man clause. And I thought, well, they're not going to believe me that I'm going to be around 63. I'm going to be doing this. So what happens? And I met my financial objectives, thought I'd be a non-executive director, was put off it because the laws against being a director in Australia are pretty onerous. If it goes into bankruptcy, you are liable to pay off the creditors. And what happened was my older daughter, who was that time was a team leader at Scandia, just got a job with Perpetual, and she was managing 30 people before she was 30. And she said, "Dad, you've read all the management books. What should I read?" And I said, "Well, the most important skill for manager is people skills. And what you should do is read." And then I thought about it, and this is a good question, right? What do you recommend to a 30-year-old daughter who's just got her first decent management role, so she's under 30? What book would you recommend them to become a successful manager? And there's a long pause. And there's another question for your chat show. What book do you recommend to a 30-year-old girl who's just been promoted from team leader to being a manager of 30 people? What book would you recommend them to read?
Great question, Chris. Okay, put it in the chat, people. What do you think? What book would you recommend someone moving into land management for the first time? What would be your gift to them? I think I would, before I come across your material, probably have recommended How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Yeah.
7 Habits of Highly Effective People, says Scott. Yeah, but Stephen Covey doesn't go amiss. So we've got Dale Carnegie and Stephen Covey. What book would you recommend you give to someone moving into management? John Maxwell's 5 Levels of Leadership, 7 Habits, the Go-Givers Leadership book. That's a new one on me, Carol. I'll have to get the details of that from you. So we've got John Maxwell, Stephen Covey, and Dale Carnegie and Go-Givers.
Well, as I said, this is a pretty intelligent group, because I actually recommended the Stephen Covey book. Gave Louise a copy of it. But if you read if you ever have a copy of the handbook, you look inside, you'll see the dedication is to my elder daughter, Louisa, who, on becoming a manager, asked me what book she read. Because I said, right. And Stephen Covey's book is excellent, by the way. And why do I particularly love it? Of course, 7 Habits. He's read Miller's paper, I'm sure. So anyway, what happened is that, and the handbook is basically on people skills for managers. So anyway, I'm running workshops. I converted the handbook of the MBA studying, got them on Kindle. I was coaching people in emotional intelligence and running coaching programs. And then one of my clients, who said to me, he was the chief operating officer of a business called HealthCert, which does online video training to postgraduate training for doctors. And he's built up to about $15 million turnover. It's pretty successful. And he said, "Chris, you've got to develop online video courses. This stuff that you've taught me is fantastic." So that's what happened. So that was my project during COVID, right? So that's my story on emotional intelligence. Now, what happened was I started doing all this work. I developed various ideas. But what I'm going to do now is go back to the beginning and actually talk about the model and how it actually works, because I think that's very important. So it starts off, believe it or not, 1920, who was asking this question: what drives our core emotions? What makes us sort of tick? So what happened was, what Rosenhoff did, came up with 2 brilliant insights. The first insight was, we're not sane or insane. He said, we're all slightly mad. So you've got these spectrum disorders. And he said, that's what so you're on a spectrum. You aren't sane or insane. You're in shades of gray. Now that's now, of course, very much the commonly held view. But in 1920, it was extremely rare that we looked at it. And then the second big insight he came up with, he said, well, actually, and compared to the number of physically things that can go wrong with you, there's only 4 mental illnesses. So, and he said these were the 4. One was called cyclodia, which we'll talk about in a bit more in a moment, but effectively is the bipolar personality disorder. Next mental illness was schizophrenia. Then he had a third one called hysteria, which I'll talk a little bit more about, and then epilepsy. And then he said there was a 5th component called the normal, which acted as a controlling factor on the other 4. And that was Rosenau's model. Well, what happened was in 1935, Hum and Wadsworth picked it up, and they developed the first decent personality test using a technique called factor analysis. And they said, Hum and Wadsworth said, Rosenau was on the right track, but there weren't 5 factors, there were 7. And he said, normal's normal. Hysteria was, and I learned the system, this is what's called hysteroid. Cyclodia broke down into manic and depressive. Schizophrenia developed into autistic and paranoid. And epilepsies were called epileptoid. I'll talk a bit more about them in some detail, but not very much. Right. Now, what happened in 1993 is when I wrote the book originally using terms like epileptoid and hysteroid. And Jill said to me, she said, Chris, you cannot use these terms, they're too pejorative. And what actually happens, we never did actually use this. We used to say people had a lot of M in their personality, or they had a lot of A, or their H was very low. That's how we talk about them. So what I did is I turned the terms into basically using mover, double checker, artist, politician, hustler, engineer, and normal. Now, I could go in much more detail about the 7 components, but in fact, Walter Blackburn has given a webinar here on the sympathy selling styles. The names are slight, but names are pretty common. There's a couple of different changes, and he recommends 1 or 2 new ones. That's fair enough. That's his prerogative. But that's the link to the video. And if you want to learn more about the 7 components, one good way is to actually watch Walter Blackburn's video, which is this one, which was the webinar that he gave originally to your group here. However, what happened was at 1990, the emotional intelligence bandwagon started. And the 2 gentlemen that have got this sort of primacy of claim about it were 2 people called Salovey and Mayer. And they said emotional intelligence was a bit like IQ, right? And what said it was the ability to perceive, control, and evaluate emotions. This is, they've since transmorphed it into what a thing they call the ruler. And they say the secret of emotional intelligence is people who can recognize, understand, label, express, and regulate emotions. And one of the big questions is it inborn talent or a learned skill? Well, thank God for the what the training profession would say is it's a learned skill. I mean, IQ is effectively inborn, right? I mean, it's genetic, but you can learn emotional intelligence. Okay, you can learn to basically do these emotions. However, the big breakthrough in emotional intelligence happened in 1995 when Daniel Goleman published Emotional Intelligence. He actually approached Salovey and Mayer and said, you know, I like what you've written, your papers, etc. I'm interested about it. He was a science writer for the New York Times. He writes extremely well. The book's very, very clear. It sold 5 million copies in 5 years and put emotional intelligence in the management lexicon, right? And he answered 2 questions. Why is EQ important? And what is emotional intelligence, right? So why is EQ important? Well, if you ever seen this picture, this is the little girl doing the marshmallow test, the famous marshmallow, where it was developed by a gentleman called Walter Mischel, who was a professor at Stanford, and he had 2 daughters, and they were going to the big nursery school at Stanford. And he carried out this little exercise over a couple of, I think it was 3 or 4 years, and his 2 daughters participated as well. And they'd have a room, quiet room, plate there, as you can see, a marshmallow, bring the little child in and say, look, we're going to leave you alone for 10 minutes. If we come back in 10 minutes time and the marshmallow is still there, right, we're going to give you another one. So that's what they had to do. They had to hold back, right? And that was the big thing. And what happened was about 10% of the kids could hold back. Now, if you've got 2 daughters, which I'm one of the people who do, as they develop through school, you can actually talk about who's going to what, who's doing what, who's getting to university, who's on the school council, who's the head girl, all these sort of things. And what Michel suddenly noticed that later in life, these 10% who held back were significantly more successful. And Goldman uses this example of emotional intelligence. He said, these are people who can control and regulate their emotions. Now, there's a very good article in the New Yorker called Don't, the Secret of Self-Control, which is all about Michel. It's an excellent article, but there's a wonderful irony in it because Michel basically was one of those people who had no self-control. He was addicted to smoking. I think he smoked something like 30 or 40 at least 30 or 40 a day, had no control over his emotions. It was extremely ironic. All right, but it's just as interesting. So that's basically why Goldman said He said that's the secret to success, or one of them is basically to have high emotional intelligence. He also came up with a definition, and I think this 2x2 matrix is the best one I know. It's just self on the top row and others on the bottom. And then in the vertical columns, there's understanding on one side and influence the other. So what you've got to do to develop emotional intelligence is to first of all develop self-understanding. And one of the fastest ways is to actually do a personality test. And basically self-influencing is learning to control your emotions. Okay, mindfulness has got a lot of people in favor of it. And then understanding others, well, that's empathy and how you develop empathy. And then influencing others, social skills. Mind you, this was not Goldman's original definition. He had a fifth factor called motivation. And you always know how good someone is in emotional intelligence is if they quote motivation as one of the 5 factors of emotional intelligence. You know, Goldman has basically disowned that. He went down a route called competencies, but that's a different issue. But now he says these are the four dominant vectors. So how do you lift your emotional intelligence? This is the big question. Now, this is just a list I just recently saw on some list. And quite frankly, I mean, it's like, pay attention to body language, learn to practice generously aesthetic feedback, become an active present listener. I mean, look, these are very good. I mean, I sort of looked at this and said, yes, and then as your 9th factor, walk across Sydney Harbor. But the big thing is, these are motherhood statements. It's not a system. And that always, I'm something person who actually likes to see processes and systems in place. I mean, I've got a lot of engineer in my personality. And the great irony in Goldman's book is in Appendix A, the final paragraph, he is answering the question, which I never couldn't get over, but he didn't follow up on it. Now, what happens is in the Appendix A, he's actually sets himself the question, is there a theory of core emotions? And he actually talks about a guy called Paul Ekman who did sort of work with pre-literate populations in Papua New Guinea and how facial expressions lead the way. But the main thing is, he said he had these 4 levels of what I call emotional intensity. You had emotions, and this is all the people all the time. It's estimated we go through 4,000 to 9,000 emotional shifts a day, right? And then he said, then we have people have moods. Most of the people, some of the time, are in a mood. And then he said there's temperament, and this is your emotional genetic predisposition, which is like 30% people most of the time are exhibiting their temperament. And he said, what happens if your temperament is very excessive, right? You end up having a psychological disorder. Well, of course, Rosenoff worked in the reverse direction. He worked from the disorder to the temperament, to the mood, to the emotion. And that's where I think the direction you should go in. So now my big mantra is people drive performance and emotions drive people. That's sort of standard emotional intelligence stuff. But my argument is temperament drives your emotions. And now, luck and memory are very important in your life. There's no doubt about that. But there was a lovely study done at King's College of over 11,000 identical twins. And they're basically what made for exam success. And what they came up with from doing their analysis was that 58% exam success is due to genes, 29% is due to teachers and schools. Now, of course, teachers don't basically like that. Okay, but that's fact. And I always say that's an extremely good argument why nature is twice as important as nurture. I'm not saying that nurture is unimportant. Okay, but what I am saying is that nature is twice important. And temperament is your genetic emotional bias. And I like to define EQ as by saying it's achieving self-mastery and social mastery by being smart with core emotions. That self-mastery is awareness and management, social mastery is empathy and social skills. And temperament is much more important than your transit emotions. Now, what happened is I'm working on emotional intelligence, and I end up setting up with a guy called Bruce in America, and I bet over there, and he became basically a distributor of the 7-MTF. And what happened was he said, Chris, you've got to change certain of the terms. Mover and hustler have connotations in America. And he said, normal, calling me normal, that's not very good. And I said, well, actually, you're right. So I came up with these, we came up jointly with these new terms, which is what I now use. And I call the model 7MTF, which stands for 7 motivational temperament factors. The other thing is I realized working that a number of the mental illnesses were wrong. And for example, effectively, hustlers weren't history. They were basically psychopaths. Engineers were basically people who are high in the obsessive compulsive disorder trait. And regulators are basically driven by their level of neuroticism. Because neuroticism is actually how well you control your emotions. So I changed a couple of the mental illnesses, and we changed some more of the terms. And that's the model I preach now, is the 7MTF. And the first thing you got to say to yourself, is the model valid? Well, the gold standard now in psychological or by organizational psych is a model called the 5-factor model, and says there's 5 personality traits that are basically determine 80% of your personality. These are openness to creativity. You remember using the acronym AUCTION: openness to creativity, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And what happens is these overlap with 5, the most common 5 of the 7 MTF components. And the artist is the creative, engineers are conscientious, extroverts are socializers, double checkers are very, very agreeable, and regulators are basically non-neurotics, a complement. And then it also handles, and I think this is very important, the corporate psychopath, which is a go-getter with low regulator, and a corporate bully who is a politician with low regulator, right? But the important thing is many, many managers, i.e., and many, many decision makers have the corporate psychopath in them as a major dominant component. And basically, they also have a lot of politician in them. And that's the important message. So it's basically what I sometimes say, they say, what is the 7MTF? I say it's a 5-factor model plus 2. So I just talked about 3 of the competitive products. The big 3, as I call them, is neurolinguistic programming, is a major system. It says basically we accept data in 1 of 3 channels. It's visual, kinesthetic, or auditory. And, and it has these 3 types of way of getting the information. And, NLP, the problem with it is it's basically the Department of Defense spent $50 million proving that it was wrong. Okay, it was just effectively, that was first thing. And one of the wonderful, I think it's psychobabble. But one of the other things is for you, I always think the ironies is effectively sold as a methodology of improving your communication. And the 2 founders are involved in this incredibly long and protracted lawsuit. Okay, and I think, well, it's not that good a communication system, but onwards it goes. I mean, the second one that's very popular, of course, is DISC. It puts you in 1 of 4 boxes, and it's pretty simplistic. It was developed by a chap called Marston. In fact, he was the inventor of Wonder Woman, believe it or not. And by the way, I don't recommend the latest Wonder Woman film. But that, on the other hand, it sort of deals with, it says that it was actually set up originally, believe it or not, as a theory of sexual submission, whether you're a dominant, influenced, submissive, or compliant, right? The main thing in problem with disco, it's a type theory, not a trait theory. Now, the difference between type and trait is that type theory, and the classic example is extroversion. Okay, Myers-Briggs and sort of DISC basically say you're basically an extrovert or an introvert, right? Or you're people-orientated or you're inwardly orientated. Whereas trait theory says there's a quality called extroversion. Okay, it's normally distributed. 67% of the population are plus or minus 1 standard deviation. Okay, and effectively they even got a new name in the model. It's called ambiverts, right? And trait theory is what you have to be, not a type theory. The second problem was basically just this: is it basically lacks scientific validity. It's only a 2-factor model, and it isn't that reliable, and it's etc. Then finally, we got of the big 3, Myers-Briggs. It's actually, to me, a model of decision-making, not core emotions. Big problem with Myers-Briggs, 16 types is too difficult to remember. It's greater than the magic number 7, right? Everybody knows their own profile. If you ask anyone about a Myers-Briggs profile, anyone who's done it. And finally, secondly, it's a trait type theory. It's not a trait theory. And again, it lacks scientific validity and reliability. But the results change when you take the test, sort of several times. So that's the big, which is the test of reliability. Now, but unfortunately, that's the bane of my life, because I was trying to work out what happens. The first people who have contact with the profiling system, it's a massive moment of epiphany. It's a very positive aha moment. They say, aha, I now understand people. I realize that they're different. And the reinforcement is very strong because they immediately start classifying people, getting positive reinforcement. They say that. And my problem is once you learn a system, once infected, it's impossible to change. Occasionally you get people to change, but that's basically the situation. So to summarize, the 2 keys to career success. First of all, you want to be good at one-on-one meetings. That's going to be your goal. How do I get good at one-on-one meetings? Well, I think that the best and easiest way is you want to learn a profiling technique where the focus is on temperament. It's scientifically valid. It's based on traits, not types. And it's easy to learn and remember, and that's the magic number. And the fastest way, if you want to learn about it, okay, so you go to my website, which is there listed down below, or you can do a course. And with my special offer, because I know this is what you got to do, and I'm finishing up now, fastest way to get to my website is just Google GoListen EQ and you'll get there, and that's what it looks like, the front page. And across here are 3 buttons. And if you sign up for a course and then send me an email with your mailing address, so I need to know where you're going to mail it, I will mail you a copy of the Hum Handbook worth $40, and you don't pay it. You get a book for free and I pay for the postage. So that's my offer to you. So that's the technique. And all right, and I say it's basically 45 minutes, so it's time for questions, Bob.
Chris, right on the money, 45 minutes, well done. Yeah, and in the exit survey, there is a link to complete your details if you want more information and want that extra material from Chris. I've also put a link to his website in the chat. But yes, let's have some questions. Either put your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and I'll field the questions and hand them over to Chris. Chris, first question that's in is, what is the easiest way, in your opinion, to start spotting the traits? Of course, other than coming on your program, what's the easiest way to start spotting traits?
Well, you got to learn the system. But what happened was, I mean, as I said, when I was writing the book, Everything's Selling, I developed this acronym called Top Dog, because what happened was Chandler McLeod got the copyrighted test and they started giving the test to lots of people. But then they'd follow up after doing the test, and it took about 40 minutes to do the one that Hum was generated, and they've sort of done some modifications to it. But what happened was they started having interviews with people, and they noticed people, for example, that were high in the politician component were always late for the meeting, and they generally wore a blue suit and a blue tie. And so what happens? They started developing these sort of what they're called heuristics, sort of rules. And when I learned the system, we learned this different ways of heuristics. But what I did was I realized that the way people talk is a huge clue, and that's actually been proved. Talk is almost, your voice is almost more important than your eye. All right, when you're basically working out whether you're going to trust someone. I mean, that's latest psychological research. Then when I said the organization that people work for and their position in that organization are 2 big clues, because and then dress is another one. Then what your office looked like. Now, I know a lot of times you're in office, but what people's home look like can be is a clue in the environment. And then what I call the gambit. Do they keep you waiting for the meeting? And how soon do they learn your first name? So the top dog is a simple clue. There are other clues. For example, and I remember Kevin Chandler describing this, the car that people choose to drive and the color of the car, very important. For most people, the car is the biggest investment acquisition they make outside their home, right? And if you talk to any car salesman, they'll tell you it's an emotional decision. And in fact, in my training course, I've got this wonderful video, which is getting somewhat dated, but it's terrific because it's people talking about the different cars they drive, and why they bought them. And it's an emotional decision, right? So that's the big thing about it. So these are the clues. And what happens is, I say it's putting the glasses on. Once you put the 7 MTF glasses on, you look at people completely differently, right? So that's what happens, and you suddenly realize it. And and as I said, that's what happens. But it really is. But as I said, the introduction course that I've sort of the online takes about 5 hours. It's the sort of the first half day of the training course I normally takes about 5 hours to run, and that's where you learn the 7 components and then how you recognize them. And, but, I mean, but Walter, for example, I know has actually developed a training course for call centers.
Yes.
Right? Where he's running, and which is so they're handing people calls, and they had a significant increase in productivity because people actually learn to recognize which types they are. And I notice it with people on the phone, and I notice when people are driving. I think, oh God, I'm behind a white Volvo. This is going to take me ages to get home now. or a white Toyota. You think, oh, here we go. So there, yeah, right. Stopping at every roundabout, waiting until it's totally clear, etc. But I'm just trying to give you a flavor. But that's what happens. So,
yeah.
But the other side of it is, you then actually develop a lot better self-understanding because you say to people, that's the way they are. For example, I'm married to a double checker, right? If I didn't know the hum was originally, and I don't 70 MTF now, I would be divorced from her. But now I realize that, in fact, that's the way she is. Now, they're very agreeable people. She's been a fantastic mother to my 2 children. She's a wonderful grandmother. I've survived 5 bouts of cancer. She's been terrific nursing me through it, right? So I'm just saying, I mean, and you just say to yourself, that's the way she is. And when she asks me, have you checked all the doors? I say, yes. I know you haven't. And she goes around and checks, I've locked all the doors. That's her. That's the way she is, right? And you don't say, oh, I can't stand it. You just said, that's the way it is. Relax. Don't worry about it. Don't forget.
It's amazing how it diffuses things. People who are late used to wind me up chronically until I understood what might be driving that behavior, and it completely diffused it for me. So I would agree. Top dog is an amazing metaphor, a great way of beginning to learn to spot traits, and those traits just are so obvious once you understand the model. That's one of the beauties about the empathy model that you've created, Chris. It's so easy to understand and so easy to use. Talking about understanding, another question's come in terms of understanding ourselves. Are there particular jobs that suit someone's temperament better than others?
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the greatest tragedies, is that when people are basically trying to do a job that their temperament is not suitable for, right? And I had a wonderful example of that just recently, and it was a chap, and I'll give you an example. Okay, I thought at one time I'd go on the professional speaking circuit and see if I could do it, right? And and I actually managed to do some corporate finance work for one of the leading speakers bureaus. I was using it as an entree. And then I invited her along to one of the webinars I was giving to, I think it was the American Chamber of Commerce, American Australian Chamber of Commerce here. It was a 2-hour seminar, in fact, on empathy, the model. And at the end of it, she said to me, Chris, 2 problems you've got. First of all, I could probably get you a grossing $750,000 a year. And I thought, well, that's not bad. I'll listen to a bit more of this conversation. And she said, now we want 20%. And she said, you got to work 200 days a year. And I went, oh. And she said, you got to remember 180 of them are going to be outside Sydney. You're going to be in hotels and airplanes. We don't want you working with us. And of course, I'm now very fortunate. I was independently wealthy. I like my golf and my bridge. And I thought, I don't want to do that. I've done my time in bloody airplanes. I don't need to do that anymore. So anyway, that was, stuff. But she said, the other thing, Chris, is, you talk about your technique. She said, you're not suited to being a speaker. And that was basically what Shannon McLeod said. When I actually did the test, I thought I had a reasonable degree of mover in me, or what we call socializer, that energetic. And they said, no, what's happening is your double checker is through the floor. You've got high apparent end. Right. And what I'm good at is doing a job for about 5 hours. I'm very consistent. That's how I got through the distinction of the MBA. I just did 5 hours a day, every day for 3 months, just working. And I said, do it. But that's my strength. I'm very good at completing projects and getting them done. But however, I'm doing the energy. And if you look at public speakers, they got 2 characteristics. One, they're go-getters. They listen, they want the ka-ching. But secondly, they've got phenomenal energy. Guys like Anthony Robbins, they've got tremendous energy and they're very, very good. That's their base. That's what you need to be a public speaker. And this chap that I was talking to was trying to become a public speaker. Now he did the test. I said, we'll do this little test. So he did it. And he was an artist engineer. This is the most introverted combination of the lot. And he had tried. And he was saying, I don't understand it. And I said to him, the reason you don't is I said, you're doing the wrong, you've been trying the wrong secret. That's not the secret to success. And it was a tragedy. So it's, and I've had that with various people. They've come to me. And sorry, I could give numerous examples, but effectively, where people come to me and they said, I'm thinking of doing X. We've gone through the profile. I've got, when I coach them, I make them do a full-blown Shannon McLeod test just to basically make sure we're on the right track. And often the advice is, look, you're actually not in a bad position, right? Be happy with what you've got. What do you think you're doing? You're not suited for that, right? And the best one is entrepreneurs. As I think the example to me is that we site tested when I was in venture capital, as part of our screening process, we site tested the people, personality tested them and got their IQs. Most entrepreneurs have high verbal IQ, right? But that doesn't make you successful, right? The ones that are successful had high numerical IQ for one thing, which stunned us. But we thought we could hire a CFO would be good. Well, that didn't work out. Right. The guy has to understand the numbers, because as the business grows, it changes from managing people to managing by numbers. That's just the reality. And you've got to be able to do that. That's what the good ones can do. The second thing is the two characteristics you need to succeed, and we were choosing the wrong people, right, are definitely go-getters. They want to make money, right? And the second thing is they've got very high engineers. They see the business as a project, and they're complete monomaniacs on it. That's and my favorite example, we have a company that's been very successful with ResMed, and Peter Farrell was the entrepreneur that got it going. No matter what you talked about with Peter, golf, wine, food, sex, if within 5 minutes the conversation started, it was switched to sleep apnea and what you needed to do to succeed. No matter what you were talking about. But he was brilliantly successful. Okay, and the only thing that irritates me, I didn't have a venture capital fund. And the guy who was backing Shannon McLeod at that time, sort of turning it around, he came up to me, he said, you understand a bit about venture capital and entrepreneurs? And I said, yes. And he said, what's Peter Farrell of ResMed like? And I said, well, actually, I think he's the best entrepreneur in Australia. If I had money, I'd back him instantly.
Wow. And
the bastard put in $3 million. 4 years later, walked away with 300 million.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
Well, he's not a bastard. He has his fund those. He always treated me very kindly after that. So there we are. But Farrell's just the one. But I've met other ones, and that is the secret. I never feel spread. The guys, it's the focus on the money and the focus on just absolutely monomaniac projects, right? So there we are.
Okay, Chris, we've got a bunch more questions. See if we can squeeze a few in the last 4 minutes. Is it a management myth that feelings are soft and for losers?
Feelings are soft but losers.
Is it a management myth that having feelings makes you soft and therefore a loser?
That's promulgated by artists and politicians, particularly, etc. I think the hardest thing that basically managers is soft is you got to learn to say no. To me, that's like one of the great secrets to management. You got to know how to say it. But it's about, but that's the reality. And in fact, having basically a sense of people's emotions and learning how to trace, etc., is quite the opposite. It's very, very important you can do that, particularly if you're doing things like trying to build a successful team. Because successful teams are diverse, right? And you got to be able to be sensitive to differences of people. And then there's going to be conflict between that group, but you got to be able to resolve the conflict and know how to do it. And you do this by dealing each of the different types different ways. Right. Yeah. What you got to learn effectively when you say management, I think, is you don't play checkers. You're playing chess. You've got different pieces, different time. That's how you have to think. And this is what this model helps you do.
Fascinating. Okay, thank you. Another question, which a couple of people have seen in the chat and are supporting. So I've got to ask this one. How have you found one-to-one meetings have changed now so many are online due to the pandemic?
Well, it's much tougher. I mean, I'm the first to admit it, because you haven't got the number of clues. Okay, and it's much better to be face to face. And it's very, very interesting. I mean, I'm out of the workforce, etc. But my younger daughter, in fact, she works for the Millionaires Factories, is known in Australia, Macquarie Bank. And she effectively has said, she said, Dad, we're actually at Macquarie, the whole drive now is to get the meetings back into face-to-face, because you just get so many more clues when you're dealing. I mean, she understands this model, but she said you get so many more clues when you're dealing with people face-to-face. Now, getting to that position is going to be tougher, but it depends where you are. I mean, by the way, I mean, you know, I realize you're sort of in sort of a state of COVID terror at the moment. We're in the one state in Australia, which basically is, you know, people aren't wearing masks. You know, I was at the theater last Friday. I was at the theater on Monday. Right, I was in the sit-down dinner today. There was about 150 people there, all sitting, etc. It's, you know, and people, you know, and as they say, they want to come into the city. They want to basically meet people again, and they like meeting people face to face. They want the interaction, right? And that's what's happening, and that's good. I think that's people, and I think you need it. But it's much tougher. I'm the first to admit. But there are also great clues. I mean, the simple thing now is I always check a person's, if I'm going to meet them, check out their LinkedIn profile, right? If they're not on LinkedIn, my first question is why, and you look and you get amazing clues from it. I mean, again, I talk about it, so I mean, etc. But you get great clues from a person's LinkedIn profile onto what the personality is, right?
Chris, it's been a phenomenal session. Thank you. We've even got a couple of delegates in the chat who said they want to come and work with you. So I think you might end up with some new employees after the end of this session. Chris, if you can flip the slide over, then we can start to wrap up the session.
I'm sorry, there you go.
We've had an amazing session from Chris, who is a huge guru. As you can tell, a big fan of his work. He's made a big difference to me. So I hope you've enjoyed all the stories and the intricacies of how this model's come together and how it's helped other people succeed. Next week, we have another huge personality beaming in from the States. This is a guy, Dave Roby, who started life as a salesperson, ended up as president of the company by the age of 30, and grew that company to one of the most successful, fast-growing, privately held companies in the States. This guy knows how to develop a high-performance team. So come and talk to him next week. Chris, if you can flip to the next slide.
Right.
Remember to fill in the exit survey, because there's interesting things that you can get from Chris. If you fill it in and give us contact details, I'll pass them on to Chris. Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Have a great week and see you next week. Bye, everybody. Okay.